Welcome. This content was generated by artificial intelligence, so it may contain errors. Please listen carefully and critically evaluate everything you hear.
Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take what you think you know and give it a serious, rigorous polish.
Today, we're wrestling with a question that really it impacts everything from how we grieve to how we vote.
It's a huge one. What exactly are we waiting for?
And maybe even more urgently, what are we supposed to be doing about it in the meantime?
We're diving into a stack of source material today that meticulously unpacks the widespread confusion around Christian hope.
It's a confusion so deep that the historically grounded answer is, well, it's often simply unheard, not even rejected, just unheard.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to trace the profound distinction between the popular idea of just going to heaven.
Which is what most people think.
Exactly. And the core biblical doctrine of bodily resurrection.
And then, and this is the key part, we want to demonstrate how that distinction generates a surprising, powerful, and frankly, a demanding mandate for mission right now in the present.
Okay, so let's unpack this right from the start. The sources are crystal clear on this. There is a massive knowledge gap.
A huge one.
It's not just that the wider world is confused about the ultimate Christian hope. It's that many Christians themselves are operating on a theological assumption that is fundamentally different from the ancient historical one.
And because of that, they fail to connect the ultimate future hope to any practical present-day action.
Why is that?
Because the hope they hold is basically an escape plan. It's not a renewal plan.
Get me out of here, not fix this place up.
Precisely. And this confusion, it doesn't stay in church. It leaks out into the public square. It shapes how our whole society handles the biggest questions of existence, loss, community.
To really set the scene, the sources offer these 5 vivid snapshots. They're like little case studies that capture this modern muddle of belief, half-belief, sentiment, and superstition.
They're really powerful.
Let's run through them. We can use them as diagnostic tools to see where the cultural consensus is right now. First up is the staggering public reaction after the death of Princess Diana in 1997.
That event was a lightning rod. It wasn't just an outpouring of grief for a beloved figure. It exposed a profound, almost desperate uncertainty in the public about what happens to the dead.
I remember the images. The sea of flowers at Kensington Palace.
Exactly. But it was more than flowers. People loved cards, sure, but also teddy bears, personal letters, little objects. The source calls it a rich confusion of belief, sentiment, and superstition.
So a desire to do something, but no clear idea of what that something was or what it meant.
That's it, perfectly. There was this intense desire to mark the loss, coupled with a complete lack of a coherent language or theological framework for what might lie beyond. It just showed that any clear traditional Christian teaching on the afterlife had largely dissolved.
Into what?
Into a kind of sentimental fog.
That deep uncertainty you mentioned. It contrasts so starkly with the very swift, almost aggressive public reaction to the second snapshot.
Oh, yes. The truly bizarre case of the soccer coach Glenn Hoddle in 1999.
The Hoddle farce, as the sources call it.
It's fascinating because it highlights what the public will condemn, even while they're embracing all this vague spirituality.
Remind us what happened.
Hoddle was the manager of the England national soccer team, a huge position, and he was dismissed because he publicly said he believed in reincarnation.
But it was more specific than that, wasn't it?
It was. He said that sins committed in a past life are punished by disabilities in the current one.
Which is, of course, deeply offensive.
Horribly so. But the backlash wasn't just about the moral offense. The interesting part is what it revealed. Just how popular the general concept of reincarnation has become in the West. People weren't shocked that he believed in it. They were shocked by the specific, harsh application of karma.
So what's the significance of that shift towards reincarnation?
From a Christian perspective, it's a total worldview replacement. It's not just a different idea about the afterlife. It's a different idea about time, history, and God.
How so?
Classic Christian hope is lineal. It's a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Creation, fall, redemption, new creation. It's about reaching a goal, a definitive endpoint where justice and restoration finally happen.
And reincarnation is.
It's cyclical. It's the karmic wheel Hoddle was talking about. It's about escaping the constant cycle of suffering and rebirth by achieving enough purity, often through your own efforts.
So it replaces God's big historical intervention.
Like the resurrection and new creation, yes. It replaces that with an endless internal psycho-spiritual process of self-improvement.
Which means a vast number of Westerners are now operating with a cyclical Eastern worldview, even if they don't, consciously think of it that way.
Exactly. Even if they've never picked up the Bhagavad Gita, it's just in the air.
Okay, moving from personal philosophy to societal practice. The third snapshot is the surprisingly modern institution of the crematorium.
Right. Cremation is now the preferred choice for the majority in many Western nations.
That feels normal to us now.
It does. But a century ago, it was almost unheard of. In fact, it was often actively discouraged by religious authorities.
Why?
Because of its implications for the resurrection of the body. The shift isn't just about practical convenience. It reflects a profound worldview change.
So how does choosing cremation connect to, say, a loss of hope and resurrection?
Well, think about the language people use. When they scatter ashes on a favorite hillside or commit them to the sea, they often talk about merging back into the created world.
Becoming one with nature.
Yes, becoming part of the wind, the trees. The sources call it a low-grade nature religion. It's an absorption model. The individual is absorbed into the whole.
And that stands in direct opposition to the core Christian claim.
Completely. The Christian affirmation is that you, a unique individual, body and soul, will be given a new, unique body and a new, unique creation. The preference for cremation subtly promotes the idea that the individual body is disposable, and the ultimate hope is to become diffuse, which completely undermines the physicality of resurrection hope.
And there's a story in the sources about this, a darkly humorous anecdote from a crematorium.
Yes, it's really something. The official recounted the story of a widow who, in her grief and confusion, included 2 large cans of heavy-duty spray adhesive in her late husband's coffin.
Spray adhesive for what?
For his toupee.
You're kidding?
I am not. And when the furnace ignited, the adhesive cans caused an explosion violent enough to bend the crematorium door.
Wow.
And while we laugh, this tiny detail, along with the practice of burying people with spare glasses or false teeth or their favorite snacks, it reflects this massive public uncertainty.
It's a tragicomic illustration of a complete failure of what to even imagine for the future.
Exactly. People are desperate to provide some kind of comfort or help for the deceased in a future they can't articulate or define. So you get this strange blurring of material practicality and spiritual hope.
Okay, from the personal to the global. The fourth snapshot, mass disaster moments. 9/11, the Asian tsunami, massive hurricanes.
These events act as existential shockwaves. When thousands die suddenly, and often so unjustly, society is forced to confront the meaning of life, the nature of suffering, and what future possibility, if any, even exists.
They force the big questions.
They do, and crucially, they raise the question of divine justice. If God is good, why this? And if your ultimate hope is just a non-physical escape to heaven, how does that address the vast physical wreckage on Earth?
It doesn't.
It doesn't. It doesn't speak to the massive injustice suffered by the victims and their bodies. The traditional Christian answer has to provide a robust physical solution for physical evil. A disembodied heaven just isn't enough.
And finally, in the fifth snapshot, a graveyard of a different sort.
The specific challenge of a place called Easington Colliery.
What's its story?
It's a powerful symbol of post-industrial blight. A place where a huge coal pit once drove an entire community, gave it purpose, gave it life, and now there's just level grass.
It's empty.
Empty to the eye, but pregnant with the bereavement of a lost way of life. And this raises the question of present hope. Hope for communities, not just for individuals after they die.
Because if the Christian message is just, escape this shabby world,
it has no coherent answer for the suffering, the despair, the lost coherence of a place like Easington.
a spiritualized hope going to heaven gives you no motivation, no mandate to rebuild the actual physical, social, and economic structures that have collapsed here on Earth.
None at all. It actually encourages you to abandon them.
So, tying this all together, the mission of this deep dive is to tackle this confusion at its root.
Because it's not just about getting your personal destiny straight. The sources argue this muddle warps our thinking about God's entire purpose for the cosmos and his present work in the world.
The confusion is so foundational that the core Christian answer, the hope of the resurrection of the body, isn't so much intellectually rejected.
As it is simply not heard. People assume they already know the answer. They think it's about spiritual survival, about souls floating on clouds.
So we're diving into the historical claim that offers a coherent and energizing basis for engagement in today's world.
A basis for joining together that ultimate future hope with a radical practical hope in the present.
Okay, let's transition into our key themes, starting with that core misunderstanding that really defines this whole crisis of hope.
Right. If you ask the average person on the street what happens after death, they'll say, you go to heaven.
And they use the word resurrection as if it just means the same thing.
Exactly. They treat resurrection, which is a physical historical term, as nothing more than a synonym for a disembodied life after death.
And that substitution, the sources say, is lethal to Christian theology.
It is. That shift equating resurrection with mere spiritual survival is essentially the influence of Platonism and Gnosticism, replacing the worldview of historical Judaism and early Christianity.
So Greek philosophy basically overwriting the original script.
In a nutshell, yes. If salvation is simply the soul leaving the body to enjoy eternal bliss, then you haven't actually defeated death.
You've just redefined it as a noble transition. A promotion, almost.
A promotion. That's a great way to put it. But the classic Christian position is that death is the ultimate enemy, the last enemy that must be destroyed by God's action in history.
And we can see this theological tension play out in how we try to find comfort. The sources contrast two classic but totally contradictory perspectives on death.
Let's start with the one that's become incredibly popular. The words of Canon Henry Scott Holland.
You hear this at funerals all the time.
Constantly. The famous passage, "Death is nothing at all. It does not count. I have only slipped away into the next room. Nothing has happened."
It sounds comforting on the surface.
It does. But the sources note that while thousands of grieving people request it, when you take it out of its full context, it offers a really hollow comfort.
Why hollow?
Because it amounts to a radical denial that death is a problem at all. In his full sermon, Scott Holland acknowledged the tragedy of death, the savage break, the profound silence, the sense of cruelty.
But that's not the part people remember.
No, they just remember the slipped away into the next room part, and that refuses to speak the truth about the savage break of loss. It offers a sentimental minimization of the very thing Christian hope is meant to overcome.
So it's trying to deny the pain rather than looking for a way to defeat the enemy that caused it?
Precisely. Which brings us to the counterpoint. The robust, defiant attitude of the poet and cleric John Donne.
Death be not proud.
Yes. Donne captures the authentic, historical Christian rage against death. He calls death a mighty and dreadful enemy, but then declares it's ultimately beaten, a mere slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men.
And his poem expresses that classic two-stage Christian hope.
It does, perfectly. First, there's the temporary rest. He calls it a short sleep.
The intermediate state.
Right, but that's not the end. It's followed by the declaration of ultimate defeat and resurrection. One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die.
That's not minimization.
That is a declaration of victory, and it's rooted in the belief that the physical realm, the body, will be redeemed.
So as we try to get our heads around this muddled Christian expectation, we also have to look at the powerful, popular alternatives that are filling the void.
Right. The cultural vacuum doesn't stay empty. The sources categorize the most common alternatives currently operating in the West into three distinct camps.
What's the first one?
The first is simple annihilation.
The end is the end.
Full stop. It's the complete denial of any future life. It's the philosophy of existential rage, best encapsulated by Dylan Thomas writing to his dying father. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light.
There's a certain clean finality to it.
It's clean in that it promises nothing, but it leaves this aching void when it comes to justice or meaning. It ultimately declares that all human endeavor, all love, all sacrifice is meaningless.
Okay, second alternative.
This one is immensely popular, reincarnation and karma.
We touched on this with Glenn Hoddle.
We did, but it's way bigger than that. It's no longer just relegated to Eastern religions. It's become a core part of Western New Age philosophy, even some psychological theory.
The source mentions the novelist Will Self.
Yes, his protagonist is this grumpy, deceased London woman who is condemned to be reborn over and over unless she can grasp a path to grace and escape the continual circle of death and birth.
So the idea functions as a powerful psychoanalytic tool.
It does. It suggests that if you didn't get it right this time, don't worry, you have infinite chances. It allows the self to endlessly attempt self-improvement and karmic debt repayment.
Which replaces the need for an external redemptive act from God.
It makes redemption a DIY project.
And the final alternative.
The low-grade, romantic absorption into nature.
This sounds like what we discussed with cremation.
It's the philosophy behind it. The idea that at death, the unique individual dissolves into the greater cosmos, the wind, the trees, the energy of the universe.
I am 1,000 winds that blow.
Exactly. That anonymous poem often left after Diana's death is the perfect expression of it. I am the diamond glints on snow. It's essentially a sophisticated form of pagan cyclical religion.
Where your individual identity is ultimately consumed by the broader biological cycle.
Right. It completely negates the concept of unique, embodied, personal survival.
Now, the sources are clear that this muddle isn't just an external problem. The church itself often reinforces it.
Sometimes with the best of intentions.
Let's look at what the sources call the Maria Shriver model, which captures what millions of children are being taught.
Right. The book, What's Heaven, and many others like it, they paint this picture of fluffy clouds, stars, eternal playtime for souls who were good.
And the body.
The body just sort of dissolves or gets left behind, and the soul lives on in this vaguely defined celestial location.
And that's profoundly different from the biblical narrative.
Completely. It prioritizes the spiritual realm as the only good place, suggesting this world is just a test to be endured before you get to the good stuff.
Which is exactly the Platonic trap.
It is. It's an anti-creation theology deep down.
So if that popular image of heaven is wrong, what does the Bible actually teach? Because the confusion seems to hinge on that one word.
It really does. The crucial difference is in the scope and direction. When Jesus speaks of the kingdom of heaven, he is not talking about escaping to a distant cloud world.
He's talking about.
He is referring to God's sovereign rule coming on earth as it is in heaven. Biblically, heaven is not the final destination. It is God's hidden dimension, the location of his throne and his governance, which presently intersects with our earth dimension. The Bible consistently teaches that God intends to join them together permanently.
That dramatically shifts the endgame. It's not a spiritual evacuation of the world.
It's the ultimate physical renewal of the world.
The climax of the whole story.
Exactly. The final vision of hope in Revelation 21 and 22 is so often misinterpreted as a flight to heaven. But if you look closely, what does it say?
The New Jerusalem comes down.
It comes down from heaven to earth, uniting the two dimensions in a lasting embrace. It's the place where God's dwelling is now among the people.
So when Greek philosophy, which saw matter as shabby or inferior, infected Christian thought,
it misled people into devaluing the body and this present created world, seeing it only as temporary, a prison to escape.
And this muddled Platonic theology, whether we realize it or not, is embedded in some of the most beloved hymns we sing.
Our hymn books are an archive of theological drift.
Okay, let's break that down.
For sure. You find examples of outright Platonism and Gnosticism woven into the lyrics. John Keeble's poetry speaks of losing ourselves in the ocean of thy love, in heaven above.
And John Henry Newman.
His language of earth's vain shadows flee suggests a yearning to escape the material world as if it's inherently flawed. That's pure escapism.
So that's the Greek influence. What else?
We also find non-Christian ideas of historical cycles sneaking in, confusing linear history with endless repetition.
The source calls this the influence of pagan cycles.
Right. Take the popular Christmas carol, It Came Upon the Midnight Clear.
A favorite.
But listen to the final verse. It speaks of the days hastening on when, with the ever-circling years, comes round the age of gold.
Comes round.
Exactly. The idea of history returning to a previous, pristine, cyclical golden age is fundamentally pagan. It reflects the myths of Greco-Roman antiquity, not the forward-moving eschatological hope of prophetic Judaism and Christianity.
What about the common image, especially in some modern traditions, of Jesus returning to take me home?
That image is often a result of later rapture or evacuation theology, and sometimes just translation choices.
You mean it wasn't in the original?
Sometimes not. Consider the hymn, How Great Thou Art. In the classic English version, we sing about Christ coming and take me home, what joy shall fill my heart.
Right.
The source highlights a crucial point. The original Swedish version was far more focused on transformation and the final unveiling of eternity. The phrase, take me home, was the translator's adaptation.
And that adaptation reinforces the evacuation view.
It does. It reinforces the idea that we are being rescued from earth, rather than the transformational view that God is renewing both heaven and earth.
That's a fascinating, almost accidental distortion. So if we strip away the Platonism and the pagan cycles, what does a hymn that gets it right look like? What's the correct, historically grounded model?
We can celebrate the structure of the great All Saints' Day hymn for all the saints. It gets the New Testament sequence exactly right.
Okay. Yeah.
First, it acknowledges the intermediate state, but only as a temporary rest or paradise. It says, "Sweet is the calm of paradise the blessed."
So a pause.
A pause, a short sleep, as Dunn would say, and only after that interim stage is the resurrection, the ultimate goal, affirmed.
What are the words for that part?
But lo, there breaks a yet more glorious day, the saints triumphant rise in bright array.
Ah, rise in bright array. That's bodily.
It is. That sequence clearly distinguishes the temporary rest from the permanent, embodied new creation, which leads finally to the New Jerusalem. It is a robust affirmation of history and bodily hope.
This analysis of all the confusion,
Yes.
it just forces us back to the historical foundation of it all.
It has to.
Which brings us to our deep dive into Easter. The sources present this massive historical challenge.
It's a huge one.
If the ultimate hope for all righteous people was an eventual mass resurrection at the end of time, why did the early Christians suddenly pivot and believe that Jesus rose alone in the middle of history?
That is the crucial question. To appreciate the sheer shock of Easter, we have to understand the expectations of the first century. It was completely off the map.
So you're saying that Jesus' resurrection is inexplicable unless something profoundly historical actually happened?
Something that forced a radical intellectual and theological reorientation. Yes.
Okay, let's start with the ancient worldview on this. What did the pagans believe about the dead?
Ancient paganism was pretty much unified on one point. Dead people did not rise. The road to the underworld was strictly one way.
No exceptions.
No exceptions. Philosophically, they split into two camps. You had the Homeric belief, where the dead were these miserable, wispy shades who desperately wished for their bodies back, but knew it was impossible.
And the other camp?
The Platonic belief, which we've touched on, the body was a prison, and being a disembodied soul was actually superior. But crucially, the word resurrection anastasis in Greek was never, ever used by pagans to mean life after death or disembodied bliss.
So if a pagan heard a Christian say Jesus was resurrected, they knew exactly what was being claimed.
Absolutely. They knew you were making a specific claim about his body. They believed in ghosts, visions, spirits. They even had a concept of apotheosis, where a dead emperor's soul goes to the stars and becomes divine.
They had words for all of those things.
Specific words. But when they heard anastasis, they understood that the claim was about new bodily life after an interim period of being dead. They thought it was ludicrous, but they understood the physical nature of the claim. The word itself guaranteed physicality.
Okay, so how did this compare to Jewish expectations? The framework Jesus' followers were immersed in.
Judaism certainly believed in resurrection, but it was expected to be a future, single, large-scale event.
At the end of time.
At the end of time, for the righteous, when God would judge and remake the entire world. This is Martha's expectation at Lazarus' tomb. She says it explicitly. "I know he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day."
And Jesus' own teaching during his ministry largely reinforced this picture.
For the most part, yes. He was working within that traditional end-of-history Jewish framework.
This context is so vital. If the expectation was a mass resurrection at the end of time, what did the crucifixion of Jesus, a figure claiming to usher in the kingdom, what did that actually signify to his followers?
It signified the absolute definitive end of the line. The game was over. They were not expecting Jesus to rise alone.
The crucifixion was proof that he'd fail.
It was the ultimate proof. It proved the Romans were in charge, the kingdom hadn't come, and he was definitively not the promised deliverer. That's why the common saying among the disciples after the crucifixion was, "We had hoped."
Past tense again.
Always past tense.
Yeah.
We had hoped that he was the one who would redeem Israel. Hope hadn't just been postponed, it had crumbled into ashes. And yet, within decades, this small, broken Jewish sect, founded on a failed, crucified leader, became a global faith whose entire non-negotiable central claim was Jesus' bodily resurrection.
A shift that big requires an explanation.
A massive one. And the sources argue that the historical force of Easter is the only thing that explains what they call the 7 surprising mutations of Jewish hope.
Okay, let's detail these mutations, because they show the sheer intellectual and spiritual discontinuity that was required to launch Christianity.
Right. If you try to explain the origins of the church without a bodily resurrection, you have to explain away all 7 of these historical changes. And, well, good luck with that.
All right. Mutation number 1, uniformity of belief.
This is a really powerful historical marker. Early Christianity was a movement composed of radically diverse people. Jews from different sects, pagans from various regions.
Real mixed bag.
A total mixed bag. Yet the sources note they showed virtually no spectrum of belief about the future life. They all converged immediately on this unique belief in the bodily resurrection of Jesus first, and then their own.
And beliefs about death are usually very conservative.
Incredibly so.
Oh.
They're resistant to change. If resurrection were just an idea they gradually adopted, you'd expect to see arguments, different factions, debates, but we find this immediate, startling uniformity.
Okay, mutation 2, the shift to centrality.
In most Second Temple Judaism, resurrection was kind of a background topic, a belief often implicit rather than explicitly debated.
But in Christianity.
It moved to the absolute, non-negotiable organizing center of their entire thought. Resurrection wasn't just part of the message, it was the message. Paul says flat out, if Christ has not been raised, our faith is futile.
You can't imagine the early church without it.
It's impossible. You can't imagine their theology, their history, their liturgy. Something with massive historical force had to put it right at the center.
Mutation number 3, the transformed body.
Jewish expectation for a resurrected body, where it existed, was often a bit vague. Maybe it was a body exactly like the present one. Early Christianity dramatically sharpened this.
How so?
The new body would be physical, it would occupy space and time, but it would be transformed. The sources call it transphysical. It would be incorruptible, animated by God's Spirit, possessing new properties.
Well, I want to stop you there because transformed is where all the modern confusion creeps in.
It is.
When modern people hear transformed body or spiritual body, they immediately think non-material, a ghost.
Right. They hear spiritual and think not physical.
So how do we ensure the listener understands that this transphysicality is explicitly not non-material?
That's the most critical distinction to make. When Paul uses the term spiritual body in 1 Corinthians 15, he isn't contrasting it with physicality.
He's contrasting it with
The animating source. The contrast is between a body animated by the human soul, psychikos, and a body animated by God's Spirit, pneumatikos.
So the new body is physically real.
Physically real, but it's no longer subject to decay, corruption, or death. It's the raw material of creation, redeemed and perfected by the Spirit.
Jesus ate fish.
He ate fish, he showed his wounds, he was handled, all signs of physicality. But it was a physicality that could also apparently walk through walls. It's a new kind of matter. Incorruptible, but definitely not a ghost.
Okay, mutation number 4, the resurrection split.
This one is arguably the most radical and forced change of all. The single expected resurrection event for all the righteous at the end of time was forcibly split into 2 acts.
Act 1.
Act 1 is Jesus' rising as the advance instance in the middle of history.
And Act 2
is the final large-scale resurrection for all God's people, which his resurrection anticipates and guarantees.
No first-century Jew was intellectually prepared for that.
Not at all. The fact that the disciples adopted a completely new timeline, moving the ultimate end-time event into the middle of history, is powerful evidence they were forced to by an event they never saw coming.
Mutation 5, collaborative eschatology.
Because the end had begun with Jesus' resurrection, his followers were charged with a new, urgent task. This is the origin of Christian mission.
That's a call to action.
It is. If the new creation has already been inaugurated, then Christians are called to co-labor with God in the power of the Spirit to implement the achievement of Jesus in the present moment. This gives rise to mission and holiness.
So the inauguration of the future demanded the transformation of the present.
Exactly. They were tasked with anticipating the final resurrection in their ethical choices and social actions.
Okay, collaborative eschatology. That sounds incredibly academic. Let's make it practical. For the listener, what does this actually mean? How did this charge change their day-to-day decisions about justice or even just community organization?
It meant they couldn't just stand by. If God's victory over death and decay has already begun, then every act of healing, of justice, of charity, of beauty is a step in that new creation process.
It's not just good works.
No, it turned followers from people passively waiting for judgment into active agents of renewal. So creating communal food banks, providing medical care to the vulnerable, standing up against Roman oppression. These weren't just nice things to do. They were concrete signs that the promised future, God's kingdom, was already breaking in and demanding action now.
That's powerful. Okay, mutation 6. New metaphorical meaning.
In the Jewish prophetic texts, like Ezekiel's vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, resurrection often functioned as a metaphor
Metaphor for what?
for the national ethnic restoration of Israel after exile or persecution.
But in early Christianity.
That national ethnic meaning disappears almost entirely. Instead, the metaphor of resurrection shifts to refer to the new individual life.
Specific.
Specifically to baptism, which is a symbolic dying and rising with Christ, and the demanding life of strenuous ethical obedience that was meant to follow. The meaning became profoundly personal and ethical, not just national and political.
And finally, mutation number 7. Messianic association.
This point is perhaps the hardest to explain away with revisionist theories. As we said, crucifixion was, according to all normal Jewish thought, proof that Jesus wasn't the Messiah.
It was the ultimate disqualifier.
The ultimate. Yet, from the very earliest fragments of creedal belief we have, Christians affirm Jesus was the Messiah precisely because of his resurrection. His definitive failure was overturned only by this unprecedented bodily vindication.
So if the Romans had captured and executed another first-century revolutionary who claimed to be king of the Jews...
Say Simon Bar-Jur.
Right. His followers wouldn't have kept claiming he was the Messiah just because they felt forgiven or had a nice vision of him.
Absolutely not. If Bar-Jur was executed, his followers dispersed. End of story. His body was there, his revolution had failed. If they had claimed he was raised, any other Jew would have immediately asked to see the body or dismissed the claim as grief-induced fantasy.
But with Jesus...
His followers, who had already fled and lost all hope, immediately began preaching his resurrection, a physical, bodily claim. It shows they were confronted with a reality that forced them to rewrite their entire theology, moving from despair to world-changing conviction.
So this massive historical effect, defined by these 7 radical mutations, it demands a powerful explanation.
Cause equal to the effect.
Let's look at the historical case for Easter itself. What the sources call the necessary duo.
Right. The sources argue that only the combination of the empty tomb and the appearances is sufficient to explain the historical rise of the early church.
Not one or the other.
No. Neither piece of evidence alone would have worked, but together they provided the complete and coherent explanation that launched the faith.
Okay, let's take the first part. Why wasn't the empty tomb enough?
Because an empty grave by itself proves nothing more than a missing body. As we noted, Mary Magdalene's first thought was that the gardener had taken the body. The Jewish leaders immediately spread the story that the disciples stole the body.
It's an ambiguous piece of evidence on its own.
Very. And we have to remember the Jewish 2-stage burial process. The body was placed on a shelf, and after a year, the bones were collected into a small box, an ossuary.
So if Jesus hadn't been raised...
Someone would have collected his bones eventually. The missing bones are central. If the disciples had just found an empty tomb, their logical conclusion would have been, we must find the body. They would not have claimed he has been raised from the dead.
Okay, so what about the other half? Why weren't the appearances enough? If people saw him, surely that's enough.
Not without the empty tomb. If the body had still been there, any sightings would have been immediately dismissed as ghosts, visions, or spiritual manifestations.
Which were common experiences in the ancient world.
Very common. Everyone had language for those experiences. The disciples would have said, we saw his spirit, or he became a heavenly being. They chose the unique, physically demanding language of resurrection. The appearances needed the empty tomb to prove that death had been physically defeated, not just spiritually sidestepped.
This combination, then, allows us to pretty quickly dismantle the common alternative theories that try to explain it all away.
They just fall apart when you face them with the historical data.
Like the swoon theory.
The idea that Jesus merely passed out and revived later, it's utterly implausible. Roman executioners were experts in death. The spear in the side confirmed it.
And even if he had survived somehow.
A half-drugged, beaten, and traumatized Jesus staggering out of the tomb would never have convinced anyone that he had miraculously defeated death and was worthy of divine worship.
Okay, what about the psychological theories? Cognitive dissonance or wishful thinking?
They fail immediately because of mutation number 7. The disciples were not expecting resurrection. They were expecting failure, disgrace, and fleeing for their lives. Wishful thinking doesn't generate a belief that completely rewrites your entire cosmic timeline.
And the idea that they just had a new spiritual experience.
That they felt forgiven or had a heart strangely warmed and interpreted it using Jewish categories, that fails too. Because, as we established, no amount of subjective feeling would translate into the historically specific, physically demanding claim, he's been raised from the dead, unless they were forced to conclude it by the evidence.
So the conclusion, then, is that the best historical explanation is the one they actually provided.
It is the only one that accounts for the historical shockwaves. Jesus was bodily raised from the dead, not a mere resuscitated corpse like Lazarus, but a new kind of physical body. A transphysical body that left the remnants of the old one behind, yet possessed undeniable physicality.
And the stories are early.
Incredibly early, they lack any precedent, and they demanded a total reorientation of the Jewish worldview. The resurrection isn't just an odd event within the old world of decay, it's the defining event of the new world that God has launched.
And here is where we connect that ultimate hope to present action.
This is the practical payoff.
What we believe about death and resurrection gives shape to everything else. This historical reality of Easter has to translate into practical takeaways for our lives today.
This is the crucial connection that is entirely lost when Christian hope gets spiritualized into just going to heaven.
If we adopt that Platonic idea that salvation is merely being away from this world, that the body and the physical creation are disposable,
It creates the exact sociological problem that critics like Karl Marx identified.
the famous charge that religion is the opium of the people.
Exactly. If the Christian gospel is fundamentally an escape mechanism from a wicked or ruined material world, it encourages acquiescence to injustice. Why try to improve the present prison if immediate release to a non-physical paradise is at hand?
It's the opium that allows people to ignore the suffering of the world.
It is. A piety that sees death as merely going home has no quarrel with powermongers and tyrants carving up the world to suit their own ends because, hey, that material world is temporary anyway.
But the robust historical doctrine of resurrection changes that calculus entirely.
It flips it on its head. It provides a foundation for aggressive, sustained action in the present.
It creates what the sources call the energizing basis for action.
An energizing basis for action now, because resurrection is part of God's final new creation. It affirms the inherent goodness of the material world and therefore the continuity between our present actions and God's future.
So what we do in the present building, creating, repairing, and acting justice, it actually matters.
It matters enormously because it is labor that will not be wasted.
And Paul draws this connection explicitly in the sources.
He spends a vast amount of energy making this point. The future resurrection is the motive for present holiness, particularly in how we treat our bodies, because those bodies are destined for transformation.
And he concludes his seminal chapter on resurrection.
1 Corinthians 15, yes. He concludes it by saying we must be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain.
That's a direct statement.
It is. The future resurrection guarantees the value and permanence of your present work.
So that's a fundamental shift. Our labor isn't just temporary damage control. It's building something permanent in partnership with God.
Right. And the sources specifically ground this theology in historic social reform.
Yes, this robust belief in the redeemability of the material world and the body, it was historically the engine for political theology and social reform.
It was the foundation for Christians who stood up against Caesar. Take the example of William Wilberforce and the abolitionists.
That fight against the slave trade.
It was based on more than just moral indignation. It stemmed from the deep conviction that the human body, even the body of an enslaved person, was created good by God and destined for resurrection.
How does that specific link work?
Well, slavery relied on the dehumanization of the body, treating people as disposable, temporary property.
As tools.
As tools. Now, if Wilberforce had held the Platonic view that the body was just a shabby shell and only the soul mattered, his activism would have been much harder to justify theologically.
He could have just said, well, their souls will be free in heaven.
Exactly. But because he believed that God would redeem the entire physical person in the new creation, he had a radical mandate to protect the body and fight for its dignity in the present. The resurrected body, perfected by the Spirit, is the ultimate standard of human dignity.
So if the resurrection means the new creation has already begun, the church's role becomes crystal clear.
The church is charged with mission. We are called to live as resurrection people.
And that means?
It means Our corporate life, our worship, our individual actions must act as tangible signs of Jesus' resurrection and as a foretaste of the final day. We're called to embody the values of the new creation, justice, mercy, beauty, restoration, in the real and painful world, demonstrating that the King who defeated death is active and has a plan for this planet.
For our final reflection, we have to turn to the ultimate challenge of Easter. It demands a fundamental shift in how we understand reality.
It forces us into a new epistemology, a new way of knowing that has to transcend mere rationalism.
The resurrection isn't just an event we can neatly fit into our existing old world framework.
No, it's the defining event of the new world, and that means we can't approach it using only the limited tools or analogies of the old world, a world defined by decay and skepticism.
So historical arguments can take us only so far.
They can bring us right up to the question. They can show that the historical room has been disturbed, that the data demands an explanation, but they can't, by themselves, transcend pure, detached rationalism to provide the full answer.
This is where we need a whole-person engagement. The sources frame this in terms of the three theological virtues: faith, hope, and love, each acting as a mode of knowing.
Let's start with Thomas and faith.
Doubting Thomas.
The archetypal empiricist. He demanded proof. He wanted to see and touch the physical wounds.
But when Jesus presented himself,
Thomas transcended the cool appraisal of detached research he had intended. He moved into a higher, richer mode of knowing, proclaiming, "My Lord and my God."
so faith is the mode of knowing that acknowledges the evidence, but then commits the whole person to the reality implied by that evidence.
Exactly. It moves beyond just demanding proof to embracing conviction.
Okay, next up is Paul, representing hope.
For Paul, hope is so much more than wishful thinking. In Romans 8, he speaks of a creation groaning, waiting eagerly for redemption.
So hope is defined by its object.
By the nature of its object, which is the Creator God's promise of ultimate, complete new creation. As such, hope becomes a necessary mode of knowing that actively anticipates that future reality now.
It's the cognitive tool that recognizes possibilities others have shut down.
And then acts on the certainty that God's promises are true.
And finally, the deepest mode of knowing, love, represented by Peter.
Peter had denied Jesus. He chose to live safely within the normal world, where tyrants win and failure is permanent. After Easter, he's called back into a new kind of love.
And love is the deepest mode of knowing.
The sources argue it is because it completely engages with a reality outside itself, affirms that reality, and celebrates it with self-giving. Love overcomes that sterile philosophical split between objective facts and subjective feeling.
It's the mode required to correspond to the reality of the self-giving, resurrected Lord.
That's it. It requires a total commitment. That's why the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein offered his profoundly challenging aphorism. It is love that believes the resurrection.
The depth of the claim is so radical
That death has been defeated by self-giving love.
that only a corresponding commitment of self-giving love can truly know and embrace it.
Precisely.
And finally, let's consider what the sources call the tyrant's fear. The suggestion that the modern climate of skepticism about the resurrection isn't politically neutral.
It's not. It carries a profound implication for power. The Enlightenment's philosophical declaration that dead people don't rise and therefore humanity can now run the world without outside interference, that went hand in hand with the political project of the modern secular state.
And this climate of skepticism aligns perfectly with the interests of tyrants and bullies throughout history.
Perfectly.
Why?
Because their power is ultimately secured by death being the last word.
The social, economic, and intellectual tyrants, the Herods, the Caesars, the unscrupulous wealthy, they don't want the dead raised.
Because if Jesus is Lord, then their power is provisional. Their injustices will ultimately be reversed, and they will be held to account.
Hope comes when we realize a worldview is possible, where the powerful do not have the final say.
Where the physical world is redeemable and where death is ultimately forbidden.
It calls to mind that terrifying image from Oscar Wilde's Salome. Herod hears that Jesus is raising the dead, and he declares, "I forbid him to do that. I allow no man to raise the dead."
That is the honest bluster of the tyrant who knows his power is threatened by eternal life and eternal justice. And the challenge for you, the listener, is to recognize that this hope is not an escape plan, but an energizing mandate.
To live as a resurrection person.
It means accepting that the new creation has already begun, and everything you do to bring justice, holiness, and beauty to this real and painful world is building toward God's future and will not be wasted.
The answer to Herod's final terrified question, where is this man?
is simply, He is in every place, my Lord, and He is working.
That, my friends, is where the genuine and surprising power of hope truly lies. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.